By 1910, a town of a few thousand people on the remote northwest coast of Australia was supplying 80% of the world's pearl shell. Not the jewel, the shell itself, the iridescent lining of the oyster, cut and polished into the buttons, buckles, and cutlery handles that fastened the coats and shirts of Europe and America. The lugger fleet that dived for it grew to more than 400 boats, working waters more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest Australian capital, in a town most of the world's tailors had never heard of and never needed to. Broome made the buttons of the world for half a century, and the world never once thought about where they came from. It would take a single decade to make sure it never had to think about Broome again. Chapter 1. Roebuck Bay. Roebuck Bay opens into the northwest coast of Australia at a latitude where the coastline itself feels like an afterthought, a boundary between an ocean most 19th century sailors preferred to avoid and an interior that gave almost no one reason to cross it. Perth, the seat of colonial government, sits more than 2,000 kilometers to the south, reached in the 1880s by weeks of coastal steamer rather than any road worth the name. Darwin is closer than Perth. Jakarta is closer than Perth. Singapore, for that matter, is closer than Perth, and so is most of the trading world of maritime Southeast Asia. Broome would grow up facing the wrong way for a colony that thought of itself as British and Southern, and the wrong way turned out to matter enormously. The bay itself is shallow and red-brown, and it is ruled twice a day by a tide that swings across a difference of more than 9 meters between the highest springs and the lowest ebb. Among the widest tidal ranges recorded anywhere on the planet, mudflats a kilometer-wide surface at low water and vanish again within hours, a rhythm forceful enough that every vessel built for this coast was designed around it rather than merely tolerant of it. Mangrove crowds the foreshore where the tide leaves standing water. Behind it the land rises into Pindon, an iron-red soil that stains the cliffs above the bay the color of dried blood and turns every unsealed road in the district the same color after rain. There is little fresh water here and less arable land. There was when the first colonial vessels began working this stretch of coast in the middle of the 19th century. No harbor deep enough to matter, no gold in the ranges behind it, and nothing resembling a reason to build a town, except for what lay on the seabed itself. Scattered across the floor of Roebuck Bay and the coastline running north toward Cossack and south past 80 Mile Beach were beds of pearl oyster, Pinctada maxima, the largest pearl-producing shell known anywhere in the world, lying in numbers no one had yet troubled to count. It was this alone that gave the coast any value at all to a colonial economy, otherwise inclined to leave it to the tide. In 1883, the government of Western Australia gazetted a town on the shore of the bay and named it for Sir Frederick Napier Broome, the colony's governor, a career administrator who had arrived from New Zealand 2 years before and would leave for Mauritius before the decade closed. He did not choose the site. Surveyors chose it for one of the only points on that coast where a jetty could reach deep water without the tide stranding a ship twice a day on the mud. The man whose name the town carries never lived in it, and nothing in the record suggests he saw much reason to. A settlement rose there anyway, first a scatter of huts and shell sheds along the foreshore, then a jetty rebuilt twice within a decade to keep pace with a fleet that would not stop growing, then stores, a customs house, streets with names. It rose in a place with no timber worth logging, and heat that made the dry season merely uncomfortable and the wet season on occasion lethal. Every person who came to Broome in its first years came for a single reason, and that reason was invisible from the deck of the ship that brought them. It was under the water. It was inside a shell that almost none of them had ever seen prized open. Chapter 2. The shell, not the pearl. The industry that eventually made Broome did not begin at Broome. It began more than a decade earlier and several hundred kilometers up the coast at Nickel Bay and the small port of Cossack, where the first commercial pearling operations on the northwest coast were organized through the 1860s and expanded through the 1870s. The method in those years required no equipment beyond a boat and a body. A diver went over the side, filled his lungs, and swam down to the beds to gather shell by hand before his breath gave out. There were no suits, there were no helmets, there was only depth, and the length of time a human chest could hold air against the weight of the water pressing on it. The men sent under in those early years were overwhelmingly Aboriginal, drawn from the coastal and inland communities of the Northwest, brought into the trade by methods that ranged from wages too small to constitute a real choice to outright coercion. Men, and at times women, were taken from their communities, held aboard the pearling boats, and sent into the water with no meaningful ability to refuse the work or the terms of it. Colonial authorities in Western Australia spent decades drafting and revising legislation meant to regulate the practice after the fact. By the time any of it had real force, the industry had already moved past breath-hold diving and past the men whose lungs had built it. What all of that labor was sent to gather is worth stating plainly. because it is not what most people assume. The pearl itself, the smooth, rounded formation an oyster produces occasionally as a defense against an irritant lodged inside it, was rare to the point of accident, and no captain and no investor built a business on the hope of finding one. A single fine pearl might cover a season's costs, or make one lucky man's fortune in an afternoon. It was a bonus. It was never the business was the shell. Mother of pearl is the nacre lining the interior of the oyster's own shell, the same iridescent substance the animal lays down around any irritant it cannot expel, coating the whole inner surface in thin, lustrous sheets. Cut into blanks, ground and polished, it became something the industrial 19th century wanted in enormous and steady quantity. Buttons for shirts and coats, buckles for shoes and belts, handles for knives and forks, inlay for furniture, fans, and gun stocks. It did not tarnish, it did not fade, it took a polish no dyed bone or base metal could match, and by the 1870s, garment manufacturers in London, Paris, and New York were buying it by the ton. This was not a trade in gemstones. It was an ordinary industrial supply chain, unremarkable in what it produced and extraordinary in what it cost to extract. A world that wanted to fasten its shirts with something that caught the light, and men held underwater on the far side of the earth from the factories that would cut what they brought up. Pinctada maxima, the gold-lipped oyster of the northwest coast, grew shell larger and thicker than any other pearling ground on earth could offer, and buttons cut from it commanded a premium in every market that saw them. Breath-hold diving could reach perhaps 4 or 5 fathoms before the human body reached its own limit, and by the late 1870s the beds at that depth around Cossack and Nickel Bay were thinning. The richer shell, everyone in the trade understood, lay deeper than any lung could carry a man. Reaching it would take something other than a diver's own breath. Chapter 3. The Diving Suit. The technology that solved the problem reached the northwest coast in the early 1880s, carried down from the pearling grounds of the Torres Strait, and before that, from naval and engineering diving work in Europe. The hard hat suit gave a man a supply of air that did not depend on his own lungs, and with it, access to a seabed that breath-hold divers could reach only in memory of what lay beyond it. Heavy and built to be, a canvas suit, waterproofed and reinforced, covered the diver from neck to boot, sealed at the wrists, and cinched to a metal corselet bolted across the shoulders. Onto the corselet screwed a copper helmet, its faceplate a small port of glass, through which the diver saw whatever the lamp or the daylight allowed at whatever depth he had been sent. Lead weights hung across his chest and back, and the boots themselves were cast in lead, each one heavy enough to anchor a man against a current on a seabed he could not see the edge of. Air came down a rubber hose from a hand-cranked pump on the deck above, worked in shifts by men who never went into the water themselves, and on whose steady turning every diver's air and life depended for as long as he stayed under. Above him worked a lugger, small, shallow of draught, rigged with 2 masts, and built specifically for this coast and this trade. Rarely more than 15 meters long, a lugger could work a pearling ground for weeks at a stretch and survive, more often than not, the sudden weather this coast produced without warning. It carried a crew of perhaps 8 or 10, a diver or 2, a tender managing his airline and his signal rope, and hands to sail the boat, sort the shell, and open the oysters on deck as they came up. Fleets of luggers working a single ground became, within a decade, the basic working unit of the entire industry. What the suit bought was time and depth, and both mattered more than anything breath-hold diving had ever offered. A hard-hat diver could work 6 fathoms, 8 fathoms, 12 fathoms, and beyond, walking the bottom for hours at a stretch rather than seconds, moving across a bed methodically rather than gasping through one frantic pass at it. He could reach ground no lung had ever carried a man down to, and gather in a single day's diving what a breath-hold crew might once have taken a week to collect. The richer beds this opened were not spread evenly along the coast. Cossack and Nickel Bay, worked hard for 2 decades, had already given up much of what their shallow water could offer. Roebuck Bay and the grounds running north and south of it had barely been touched, and what hard-hat divers found there, once they began working it seriously in the 1890s, was shell in a quantity and a quality the older fields could no longer match. South went the boats. South went the divers. South, eventually, went the industry itself, and it did not move back. Broome had a jetty built to reach exactly the depth this fleet required, and a bay lined with exactly the beds the divers were now equipped to reach. The town began to grow the way pearling towns grew. Not from farming, not from gold, but from luggers, arriving in greater numbers with each season than the one before, until the huts along the foreshore could no longer hold what the fleet was bringing in. The census of 1891 counted barely more than 100 people at Broome. It would not stay that low for long. Chapter 4. the largest in the world. In 1891, Broome had counted 120 people. By 1900, it counted more than 1,000, and the number did not level off. Ports on this coast were used to going the other way, booming for a season, emptying out the next. But Broome kept adding people the way it kept adding shell. Steadily, then rapidly, then in numbers its own jetty could barely land. By the turn of the century, it had outgrown Cossack, outgrown Nickel Bay, outgrown every pearling ground that had come before it on this coast. By 1910, there was nowhere else on Earth doing more of this work. That year, Broome became the largest pearling center in the world, and it did not hold the title quietly. The lugger fleet working its grounds had numbered in the dozens a generation earlier. By the 1900s, it numbered in the hundreds, and in 1913, it reached 403 boats, the high water mark the industry would never surpass again. Roughly 3,500 people worked the pearling trade out of this one town. Divers, tenders, deckhands, shell openers, boat builders, and the shoreside operations that graded and packed what the luggers brought in. Firms like Streeter and Mail ran fleets of dozens of boats apiece, financing the smaller masters in gear and credit and taking their shell in return. Australia in these years supplied around 80% of the world's pearl shell. Most of that 80% came up out of Roebuck Bay, was sorted on Broome's foreshore, and left through Broome's harbour in crates bound for cutters in Birmingham, Vienna, and New York, who had likely never heard the name of the bay it came from. Picture Roebuck Bay on a falling tide in 1912. Hundreds of luggers sit at anchor as the water drops away beneath them, hulls settling into the mud in the ordered rows of a fleet too large now to moor any other way. The foreshore behind them is a working district in its own right. Shell sheds, where the day's catch is graded by hand, drying yards, boat slips, the smell of oyster flesh left to rot in the sun before it can be carted off. Behind the sheds runs a Chinatown built for a workforce with nowhere else to spend its wages. Along Dampier Terrace and Carnarvon Street, stores stocked from Singapore and Hong Kong, boarding houses that let beds by the shift, gambling dens that ran through every hour the fleet stayed in port. A diver ashore after a season underwater could hear Japanese called across a mooring line, Malay traded over a card table, Hakka and Cantonese argued over the price of rice, a foreshore that spoke in half a dozen tongues and answered to none of them alone. This was not a frontier outpost improvising a culture as it went. It was a company town for an industry that had, within 2 decades, made itself indispensable to garment manufacturers on 4 continents, staffed almost entirely by men whom the country hosting them would not otherwise have allowed to stay. There were Japanese boarding houses and Japanese shrines, there were Malay mosques and Chinese temples standing within a few streets of one another on ground that, 30 years earlier, had held nothing but pindon and mangrove. Broome's jetties, sheds, and gambling dens were the visible economy. The workforce that ran them was the part of the story Australia would spend the next decade trying not to look at directly. Who these men were and how a nation already drafting laws to keep them out came to depend on them completely is a contradiction Australia never resolved and rarely admitted to. Chapter 5. The One Exception. In 1901, the pearling fleet operating out of Broome employed 998 men. 943 of them were not white. Japanese divers, most of them recruited from fishing villages on the Wakayama coast, had by this point become the acknowledged mainstay of the diving itself. The men trusted with the deepest water, the longest bottom time, the shell that paid for the season. Malay crews came aboard from Singapore and the ports of the Dutch East Indies. Kupanga crews came from Kupang, on the island of Timor. Chinese labor ran much of the shoreside trade, the stores and the ledgers and the sorting sheds. Filipino crews worked the boats alongside all of them. The industry that made Broome the largest pearling center on Earth was, by any honest accounting of who did the work, an Asian industry operating under an Australian flag. That same year, the 6 colonies of Australia federated into a single nation, and one of the new Commonwealth Parliament's first acts was to pass the legislation that would become known, in substance, if not in its printed title, as the White Australia Policy. Its purpose was not disguised. It was built plainly and on the record to keep non-white labour out of the country, to close a door that the goldfields, the sugar plantations and the pearling grounds had for decades left open. Immigration officers were empowered to administer a dictation test in any European language of their choosing, a mechanism designed to exclude by discretion whatever it could not exclude by name. And then, in the same legislative breath, Parliament granted the pearling industry an exemption, the single most significant carve-out written into the new policy. Japanese divers, Malay crews, Kupangas, Chinese and Filipino labor, all of it was permitted to keep entering the country, permit by permit, boat by boat, for a trade that Canberra had just finished declaring, in general, undesirable. The mechanism was bureaucratic and almost banal, a certificate of exemption from the dictation test, applied for by the pearling masters, renewed diver by diver and season by season, a piece of paper that let a man do the one job the nation would not let an Asian immigrant do anywhere else within its borders. The reasoning offered was practical rather than principled. White divers could not do the work, or would not, and the shell could not be gathered without the men who could. A nation that had just organized itself at its founding around the exclusion of Asian and Pacific labor, made its one great exception for a single remote town that could not survive a week without the very men the policy existed to keep out. The law that closed the door to a continent left a hole cut precisely to the shape of Broome's fleet. Nobody in Canberra recorded this as a contradiction. It was debated and passed as a matter of commercial necessity, filed alongside tariff schedules and shipping regulations, without any apparent sense that the nation had just built its founding law around the one labor force it could not do without. What kept the diving dress off white shoulders in Broome was never spelled out in the parliamentary record, though everyone in the industry already knew it. White men had tried the work in the early years of the hard hat suit, in the same boats, breathing the same hose-fed air as the Japanese, Malay, and Kopanga divers beside them. Few of them stayed in it. Fewer of them survived it. The pearling masters stopped recruiting white divers, not because the law discouraged it, but because the sea itself had already made the decision for them, one drowned or crippled man at a time. The sea had a name for what it did to them. It was the bends. Chapter 6. The bends. The reason was written in the water. The diving killed. A hard-hat diver working the depths off Broome breathed compressed air pumped down from the deck above, and at pressure that air forced nitrogen into the diver's blood and tissue in quantities the body could not use and did not need. As long as the diver stayed under pressure, the gas stayed in solution, the way carbon dioxide stays in solution inside a sealed bottle. The danger began on the way up. A diver hauled to the surface too quickly took the pressure off too fast, and the nitrogen came out of solution as bubbles, in the blood, in the joints, in the spinal cord, decompression sickness, known on every lugger in the fleet by its plainer name, the bends. It began, in the milder cases, as an itch under the skin and an ache in the knees and shoulders that a diver could sometimes work through. It did not always stay mild. It could cripple a man for the rest of his life. It could paralyze him from the waist down before he was 30. It could kill him outright on the deck of his own boat, sometimes within minutes of breaking the surface in front of the tender who had just hauled him up. The men who worked deepest and stayed down longest were the men most exposed to it, and those were precisely the divers a shell-hungry season rewarded. A lugger that filled its hold early made money for its master and the financiers behind him. A lugger that came back light did not. The pressure ran downward from the owners to the divers themselves, season after season, and it pushed men past the margins that slower, shallower diving would have kept them inside. Divers surfaced in stages when time allowed, and skipped the stages when it did not. Some learned to read their own bodies well enough to work the limit for years. Many did not learn in time. The industry that measured its success in tons of shell per lugger did not, in its own accounting, measure the men it spent to gather it. Broome buried its dead by the hundred. The Japanese cemetery within the town holds more than 900 graves, the largest concentration of Japanese burials anywhere in Australia. Laid out in rows, a visitor can still walk today. Most of the names on those headstones belong to young men who had left fishing villages on the Wakayama coast to work a diving season on the far side of the world and did not go home to it. Many of the stones record men who had not yet reached 25. Some died in a single dive. Some died days later, in a bunk aboard the lugger that had carried them out, paralyzed and waiting. Some survived one bad ascent, only to make the same mistake the following season, having concluded wrongly that they had already learned where the line was. Broome, in time, built its own recompression chamber ashore, one of the earliest of its kind in the country, a steel cylinder in which an afflicted diver could be sealed under pressure and brought back down the same gradient that had broken him, slowly, in the hope of forcing the nitrogen back into solution before the damage set in for good. It saved some of the men brought to it in time. It did nothing for the men who never made it off the lugger, and nothing at all for the 900 already in the ground. The bends took men one at a time, a diver at a time, a lugger at a time. The sea had another method as well, one that did not wait for a single boat to make a mistake. It took the whole fleet at once. Chapter 7. The blows. The bends killed a diver in the time it took his body to rise through the water column. One man, one lugger, one bad ascent at a time. The coast itself killed differently. It killed in systems that spanned tens of kilometers, dragging a fleet under all at once, in the hours before anyone on deck had time to read the sky correctly. Broome's luggers were built for shell, not for weather. They were 15 meters of timber and canvas, shallow drafted by design so they could work the flats on a falling tide. And that same shallow draft left them with almost nothing to hold them down when the wind came from the wrong quarter at any real strength. There was no harbor on this coast deep enough to shelter 400 boats at once. There was no forecasting reliable enough in these years to give a fleet more than a few hours' warning that a cyclone had turned toward it instead of away. A lugger caught at anchor in a blow had two choices, and both were bad. Ride it out on ground that offered no shelter, or run for open water into seas built to swamp a boat a fraction of their size. The coast collected on that arithmetic 4 times in the space of 50 years. In 1887, a cyclone caught the fleet working grounds off the town and put dozens of luggers on the bottom in a single night, drowning divers and crew by the score, before most of them had reason to expect the weather would turn. In 1908, another storm did the same. In 1910, it happened again. 2 blows in 3 years, that between them accounted for luggers lost by the dozen and men lost by the 100, names that went into the same ledgers and eventually the same cemetery as the divers the Bens had already claimed. Each storm was reported in the newspapers of the South as a maritime disaster on a remote coast, a paragraph or two, and then the fleet rebuilt and went back out because the shell was still there and the market still wanted it. The worst of the 4 came in 1935. A cyclone tracked in from the northwest with almost no warning, caught a large part of the fleet still at sea, and by the time it passed, dozens of luggers were gone and the dead numbered in the hundreds. The single deadliest event the pearling industry ever suffered, worse in one night than most seasons of diving accidents combined. Broome buried what bodies the sea gave back and listed the rest as lost, the way it had done in 1887, in 1908, in 1910, the way it would keep doing for as long as wooden boats worked an exposed coast in cyclone country. Something else was already testing the industry by then. Something that came from neither the water nor the sky. The First World War had reached Broome the way it reached every export economy tied to distant markets. Shipping was requisitioned, insurance rates rose, and overseas demand for shell, driven by a garment trade now consumed with uniforms rather than buttons for civilian coats, slackened for the first time since the trade began. It was not a catastrophe. It barely qualified as a warning. It was a tremor, felt and then forgotten, in a town that had already buried 900 of its divers and lost count of its luggers to weather. Broome had, by 1935, survived the bends, survived 4 cyclones, and survived a world war. It would not survive the next one the same way. The war that was coming would not drown the fleet or sink it at anchor. It would take the men first, and then it would come from the air, over a bay that had never before had to defend itself against anything but water. Chapter 8. The Raid. When Japan entered the war in December 1941, the men who had made Broome's pearling industry possible for 4 decades changed status overnight. The divers recruited from Wakayama, exempted by name from a law built to keep men like them out of the country, were now classed as enemy aliens under wartime regulation. Nearly all of them were rounded up within weeks and sent south to internment camps at Tatura in Victoria and Loveday in South Australia, removed from the boats, the sheds, and the town they had worked since before most of Broome's white residents had been born. The fleet lost the men who ran it not gradually, the way the bends and the cyclones had thinned it for half a century, but all at once by an order signed a continent away from the bay. Broome, by early 1942, was no longer only a pearling town. The Japanese advance through the Dutch East Indies had put Java within days of falling, and Broome, remote, isolated, but linked south by air, had become a refueling point for flying boats evacuating Dutch civilians, colonial officials, and military personnel ahead of the invasion. On the morning of March 3, 1942, 15 of those aircraft sat at anchor in Roebuck Bay, crowded with refugees still aboard or waiting close by the shore for the next leg of the journey south. 9 Japanese Zero fighters, flown from a captured airfield at Koepang on Timor under a commander named Osamu Kudo, reached Broome that morning with almost no warning ahead of them. They found 15 aircraft sitting on open water with nowhere to take off to and nowhere to hide, and they destroyed them where they floated, strafing hull after hull at low altitude until the bay was burning in more than a dozen places at once. Other Zeros went for the aerodrome on shore, destroying planes on the ground in the same pass. A lone Dutch airman on the beach, Gus Winkle, dragged a machine gun salvaged from a wrecked aircraft onto a makeshift mount and brought down 1 attacker before the raid was over. A single act of resistance recorded in the after-action reports. with the same flat brevity as everything else that happened that morning. At least 88 people were killed in the bay, a great many of them Dutch women and children who had already fled one country, only to die in the harbour of the next. It remains the second deadliest air raid ever suffered on Australian soil. After Darwin, 12 days earlier, the dead were never all recovered. Some went down with the aircraft into the mud of the bay and stayed there. The town, whose fortune had been built for 40 years by Japanese divers, was bombed on a single March morning by Japanese pilots. The record does not need embellishing to carry the weight of that fact. And the men who filed the reports did not embellish it. The same water that had once held the shell that clothed the world now held the dead and the wreckage of 15 flying boats, settling into the mud of Roebuck Bay, within sight of the jetty the pearling fleet had used for 60 years. In the months after the raid, Broome's pearling masters still believed the industry could be rebuilt once the war ended, the boats repaired or replaced, the divers released from internment and brought back to the grounds they knew. Some of that rebuilding did happen, but the blow that would actually end the pearling industry was not waiting anywhere in the war. It was not going to come from the sea, and it was not going to come from the sky. It was sitting, unbuilt and unnamed, on a chemist's bench. Chapter 9. Plastic. The industry did try to rebuild. Luggers were repaired or replaced through the late 1940s. Divers released from internment returned to boats that had sat empty through the war. And Broome went back to gathering shell the way it had for 60 years, on the assumption that the market on the other side of the world still wanted what the sea off Roebuck Bay could supply. For a few years it did, then it stopped, not because of the sea and not because of the sky, but because of a chemist's bench in a laboratory nowhere near this coast, worked by men who had never seen a lugger, a diving helmet, or the inside of the Japanese cemetery. In the 1950s, garment manufacturers began replacing mother-of-pearl with plastic, a button that had once required a man in a copper helmet to walk the seabed, fill his lungs with compressed air, and risk the bends or a cyclone to bring up the shell it was cut from could now be molded by the thousand, then the million, from a synthetic resin that cost almost nothing and required no one to die for it. The new buttons did not need a fleet. They did not need a harbour 2,000 kilometers from the nearest city. They did not need a workforce recruited under an exemption cut into a law built to keep men who looked like them out of the country. They needed a mold, a machine, and a supply of resin, and all three could sit in a factory anywhere on Earth with electricity. The market for pearl shell did not decline gradually. It collapsed. By around 1960, it was simply gone. The one commodity Broome existed to supply, rendered worthless by a material invented in a laboratory, a world away from the bay, it emptied. 80 years of diving, 4 cyclones, 1 air raid, and more than 900 graves in a single cemetery had built an industry around a product that plastic made obsolete in under a decade, the same span of time it had once taken the world to make sure it never had to think about Broome again. The buttons of the world did not need Broome's shell anymore. They did not need Broome's divers. They did not need Broome. What saved the town was the same oyster, used a different way. In 1956, a joint venture between Japanese and Australian partners established a pearl farm at Broome Bay, north of Broome, built not to strip dead shell from the seabed, but to grow a living pearl inside an oyster kept alive and tended for years at a time. Cultured pearls, seeded deliberately rather than found by accident, harvested by the piece rather than by the ton. It was a smaller industry than the one it replaced, and a far richer one per shell handled, and it killed almost no one to run it. Today, most of Australia's cultured pearl farms still operate along this same stretch of coast, working oysters descended from the same beds the lugger fleet once stripped bare. The rest of the town turned to what remained once the shell trade was gone. The tides, the beaches, a Chinatown built for a workforce that no longer exists in the form it once did, and the pearling history itself, packaged now for visitors rather than lived by divers. Around 15,000 people live in Broome today. The old shell sheds still stand, kept as heritage rather than industry. The luggers that survive are moored now as monuments, not worked as boats. In certain light at low tide, the graves in the Japanese cemetery face a bay that still hides, somewhere beneath its mud, the wrecks of the flying boats destroyed there in March of 1942. The headstones were never angled toward the water on purpose. The cemetery simply sits on the high ground nearest the sea, the way most cemeteries in a coastal town do, but the bay is there regardless, brown and tidal and ordinary at 9 in the morning, indistinguishable now from any other stretch of water on this coast. Broome once clothed the world in the lining of a shell. The world, in the end, found something cheaper to fasten itself with.